All right, we're joined live this hour by Professor author Gilda Ochoa. This is very very exciting to have you here with us this hour. You are the author of several seminal books. We're also a professor. I can't remember which one, but I know you're at the Claremonts. You're doing incredible work. I mean, I've seen you at conferences. I've seen you be a keynote speaker. I mean, you're really just really just happy to have you for these next this time we have together. But before we get started at all the wonderful accomplishments that you've had over the last few years, can we let's start at the beginning. Can you tell us a little bit about your educational journey and how you got to be where you go? Where
Sure.
you
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks again for inviting me. I know it's exciting to see all the work that you've been doing.
Thank
Seeing
you.
you as a spoken word artist, right? It's inspiring, and also it's just someone for yourself rooted in the local. So, in terms of my own educational journey, so I will share a little bit, and hopefully you'll ask follow-up questions to see what it is that you want to hear more about. I guess first of all, just to give you a sense of my own family, because that's been instrumental in terms of influencing who I am and my own educational trajectory. So I'm the daughter of a Nicaraguan immigrant. My father came at the age of 15 from Esteli, Nicaragua in the 1950s with his own parents. And they eventually moved, the Pico Union, among other places, and eventually ended up here in the city of La Puente in Southern California, which is where I live. My father is the oldest of two, and he struggled coming at the age of 15, right? Struggled. He eventually earned his GED, and then he went on to community college, ELAC, and then eventually, years later, was able to go on to Cal State LA and earn his degree to teach. He became a junior high school teacher. I highlight that, and I can tease out more if you want to hear the specificities. It was a lot of history of exclusion, accent discrimination, language discrimination, colorism. It was not a smooth path. And it definitely shaped his relationship with the US. And I think also how he raised my brother, and I have an older brother. I'm also the daughter, and so he was the first member of his immediate family to go to college, right? And again, community college was instrumental in that path. And then my father ended up teaching in Hacienda La Puente Unified School District, and we believe probably the first Central American teacher, if not the first Latino teacher in the district. My mother, I'm also the daughter of a Sicilian-speaking New Yorker. My mother came from New York, and she came at the age around 18 years old or so with her parents, and they also eventually moved to the city of La Puente. So I'm deeply rooted to this area. My mother is also the oldest in her family, and she was the first member to go to college as well. And she too started off like my father at the community college locally, but she went to Mount Sac. And after Mount Sac, she eventually transferred to Cal State LA, and that's where both of my parents met. And so she too became a junior high school teacher in the same school district after a while, right? She's also started teaching in the district. My father teaching at Cedar Lane School, which is a school that my brother and I went to. And then in Hacienda Heights, and my mother in La Puente, Sparks Middle School, or Sparks Junior High at that time. So in our family, my brother and I, right, being the daughter of teachers was kind of shaped our worldview, but we're also among the only ones in terms of family and cousins to have college educated parents. So I went to all public school training, K through higher ed, raised by public school teachers. They emphasized the idea of public school for the public good, right? So after high school, and I can talk more about my experiences as a high school student if you want, I went to UC Santa Cruz. This was in the mid 80s. And at that time, UC Santa Cruz had no grades. And that's what I thought education should be about. It should be about learning for the sake of learning. And I only applied to public schools, and only in California. So I applied to Santa Cruz. The way they described the school was also built around the trees and just this beautiful area, which is not where I live is nice, but it doesn't have the image of the trees and the forest and the oceans, right? So I went there for a year, and was terribly homesick, and I was on the phone whenever I could, and I would come home whenever I could visit. I ended up transferring after a year, and I transferred to UC Irvine, which was dramatically different at that time. Santa Cruz also, not only was it didn't have grades, right? It was based on evaluations. It also didn't have fraternities and sororities. And that was also one of the reasons why I wanted to be there. I didn't want to be part of or see this whole Greek scene. Irvine in the 80s was, I felt like it does not reflect the UC Irvine that we know today. It was a lot of white students coming from Orange County. I felt like there were Greek sweatshirts everywhere. And it was a little bit of an adjustment there, but at least I was closer to home and could come home all the time. I ended up getting my BA there in sociology, but I took a lot of classes in comparative culture, which is what they had there, and gender women's studies. Maybe it's called women's studies. My father died in college, so I can say more about what that was like. That was devastating, and I can say more about it if you want to hear.
Yeah, no, well, I'm very.
I'm going fast, yeah.
Yeah, no. I'm interested in getting into your story, but this pre-story with your parents coming to East LA College and then Cal State LA. Could you speak a little bit to just how important these two kind of institutions were for so much of the Latino population in San Gabriel Valley, Los Angeles, this just kind of surrounding areas, like just how important ELAC and Cal State LA are.
Absolutely. They are foundational, right, institutions that provided in the past and continue to provide in the current period a gateway for many first generation communities and families, right? They are, I want to say, kind of the bedrock of our communities. And so unfortunately, right, the skyrocketing tuition fees have made it more difficult for first generation students to access these institutions, but they're key. So my brother, I should say, teaches at Cal State LA. So it really is an institution that I have this deep kind of personal connection to because of the role it played in my own family, and then also my brother teaching. In terms of, I teach in Chicano Latino studies at the Claremont colleges. I'm at Pomona College. If we think about the role of Chicano studies at Cal State LA, that too is instrumental, right, in shaping not only opening access to first generation community members, but also in terms of providing us with greater a worldview to understanding the histories, contemporary realities of Chicano Latino communities coming out of Cal State LA, right? Thinking about Gil Gonzalez, Munoz, some of the kind of foundational people within the field. So those are key institutions.
So then can you speak a little bit to your own high school experience though, and growing up in the SGV, because it's a little it's like LA, but it's not. So it's gotta dig a little more into that one.
Yeah, no, thank you for following up. So what can I say about it? The first thing that comes to, so I came of age, I was in high school in the 80s. I think a lot of, about the school district that I was part of, especially the schools that I attended, were very assimilationist, right? No literature, no material on the communities that were part of those schools. Myself and most of my friends, we were second generation, right? We were the children of, like for myself, Nicaraguan immigrants, Cuban, Mexican, certainly Mexican Americans, Asian Americans, Korean Americans. None of that was present in any of the curriculum. And so you have these spaces with people of color, and yet we're completely erased in the history and the whole culture of the campus. I grew up, so I was born and raised in La Puente and Hacienda Heights. And so by the time I started school, we had moved to Hacienda Heights, but my grandparents were still living in the city of La Puente. So it was kind of going back and forth on the weekends, spending time with family, where Spanish was predominated, and then other family where there was some Sicilian, but largely English in La Puente, and then going to schools. So kind of living this multicultural, multilingual existence, but within our school system, that was not the case. I was tracked into honors when it came to English classes, not when it came to math. I was telling my nephew the other day that I had to retake algebra and or I guess it was geometry. But I was also a very quiet student in class, and I've written a little bit about kind of what it meant to be kind of invisible in the curriculum, but also super quiet within the classroom situation. I was
Yeah.
a runner and still a runner, so sports were instrumental for me. I was in student government, so it was like a little bit kind of navigating all these different dynamics.
Yeah. Also,
Oh, I lost you.
so tell us about now, like, okay, so you graduate high school, you get into the UC system. You begins with Santa Cruz, kind of idyllic. Get home, to come back to Irvine. Then eventually you get your doctorate at UCLA, right? So
Yes.
can you speak to us a little bit about what was UCLA campus like at the time? I mean, this is like a couple years after the hunger strike, right?
Yeah, it was actually during the hunger strike.
Okay.
Yes. So it was in the 90s. So I started at UCLA in 1990. I went right away into grad school. Again, my father had died in 1989. And so when I was thinking about, and I have my brother's 4 years older, so I always talk about having this kind of built-in mentor, seeing the path that he was taking that facilitated my path as well. But when I applied to grad school, I knew I was going to stay local because I'm so rooted to community and to home and family, and having lost my father recently. And so I started at UCLA in the Department of Sociology. Vilma Ortiz was my advisor, and she's probably gotten through the most numbers of Latina PhDs in sociology. It's incredible how many people she has been able to support, and she was key. While UCLA was not an easy place to be at, I think what definitely got me through graduate school was a cohort of women of color. And we oftentimes talk about kind of clinging to each other to kind of get us through, to feel a sense of self-worth. The other thing that was instrumental, along with my advisor, was I was a teaching assistant in gender, women's studies, and Chicano studies. And so having those spaces, again, were spaces of affirmation, spaces of critical consciousness, to be able to connect with students, where the field of sociology was very what we refer to as the DWEM, the dead white European men. It was not what I had gone to grad school for. Undergrad was sociology, but because I had been taking, again, comparative cultures and in gender studies, I thought it would be learning more about race, class, gender, and immigration. And sociology was not about that, as contradictory as that may seem. It was really about the dead white European men, very much kind of, if immigration was talked about, it was all kind of a variable. If gender was talked about, it was white women. So those spaces in Chicano studies and gender women's studies were key. The hunger strike started, I think, about 92, if I'm not mistaken, in terms of my timeline. And I was, again, as a graduate student, especially being a TA, and I was also a field coordinator. So I was working with students who were working with local community-based organizations. Vilma had hired me at that point. I was going to the demonstrations, supporting in the ways that I could, and going to various meetings as all of that was unfolding.
Yeah. We had an opportunity to interview Marcos Aguilar, and he was talking about his experience with that. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about just how vicious Charles E. Young, just how bad this guy was.
Yeah, so I guess I can't speak as directly as someone like Marcos, because he really was in the midst. I was kind of there as, I mean, again, I was a grad student. I was there going to the kind of on the side supporting, but not as intimately tied to having those interactions. There was a lot that was unfolding, right? So there was a collective of Latinas that were trying to push and make sure Latina voices were present. And then there were the hunger strikers. And then luckily there was community support in terms of the Justice for Janitors, and others that were coming out to meet and to advocate to make sure that the UCLA reflected, both in terms of population, but also in curriculum, the
Yeah.
populations that were forming the base of it. One of the things that was the impetus, right, was this budget cuts. And so there were dramatic budget cuts that were happening at that time, both in terms of the programming, but also in terms of centers, and that kind of galvanized some of the movement.
Yeah. Um, so, for your own work, I mean, the book that you come to be known for is, I want to get the title right, Academic Profiling, Latinos, Asian Americans, and the Achievement Gap. And it's so interesting because, when you attend conferences, a lot of people like to talk about their positionality, and they open that way, right? And they spend time talking about that. But it's always funny to me because oftentimes when you tell me something, I can make a guess at like where you're coming from just on the basis of the title of your work, right? So that's such a San Gabriel Valley thing to write about. That's such an SGV thing to write about. But I want to talk about your book. Before we talk about that, I'm just really fascinated by about the San Gabriel Valley, because it is that mix, right? It's a mix of Latinos, Asians, and like if you were to go to, like, say, the Pointing Hills Mall, what you will see is, a group of people all going to go see a movie, let's say, right? And you're gonna see everybody there, but you're gonna see the majority are going to come from one of these two populations, right? And then they're gonna go see a movie that reflects neither. That reflect, you know, often about Los Angeles, where neither of them are there. And so, like, just a very, it's not, because it's not just education, it's everything.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah,
And
thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, because again, there is an important kind of history that needs to be told about this area, and there's specific racial and ethnic and class dynamics, right? And that's kind of what I've been writing about, because I think it is a very unique experience, and yet there's similar patterns that resonate, right?
right. Well, I mean, it's also, I mean, as of 2000, and, like, I don't know, I think 2010 or something like that. This is about, like, there's almost 2 million people that live in the San Gabriel Valley. So I mean, this is not like, that's more than some states. And so it's not like this, like, odd thing happening over here where there's like 1,500 people, and it's interesting, but it's not very common. No, this is like 2 million people,
Yep.
right? So, like, it's a lot of people, that just, like, and that interaction, that interplay, is not part of the general American narrative as presented in a book, as presented on television, as presented in the theater, as presented, as America. It's something that, like, unless you were there, you wouldn't know exist. I mean, if you wouldn't know existed.
Yep.
You know what I mean?
Yep.
So I think it's really important that that people do this kind of work. So I want to get into your work. So can you tell us a little bit about, the achievement gap and what motivates you to write the book? And yeah.
Happily, yes. And I should say, because you were saying that it's this history and these connections between Asian Americans and Latinos aren't present in kind of mainstream media, right, and other spaces. And that was certainly the case within the academy, right? So in the 90s, as a graduate student, and even as an undergrad, I was always, how am I going to write about the city of La Puente? That was kind of always driving me, because I wanted to write about kind of my own family's history and connections and so on. And so my first book focuses on the city of La Puente, and it looks at the factors and situations that influence Chicano-Mexicano relationships. And so I do interviews. I'm all about interviews, trying to create a space for people to share their stories. And so that book focuses largely on the legacy of school segregation and kind of the up until, kind of early 2000s, late 1990s, the fight for bilingual education, how all those factors shape dynamics. But in the process of doing that work, it was largely older adults. So fast forward a couple of years after I had finished that dissertation work, becoming neighbors and focusing on La Puente, I wanted to see what was happening in our schools today that is still shaping relationships and sense of self. Because that was so key in that first book. It was interviewing older Mexican Americans who were talking about the school, segregated schools here in La Puente, the Central Avenue School, talking about, right, not learning the Spanish language, going to, and it was in the midst of the 90s, right? So, and Prop 187. So I thought, okay, let's see, if this was so formative historically, what's happening today? So I started visiting various high schools in the area to see what high school I might be able to do some research. And I actually thought I would do a school that was still largely Latino, right? To try to sense of generational differences. But I visited the school that I referred to as Southern California High School. And I said, is there any interest in this research? And then they said right away, the principal said, at this school, it's not about, Latino or Mexican American and different generations. It's really about Latinos and Asian Americans. So he said Asian Americans and Hispanics, right? Using kind of terms that we problematize and so on. And that's really the issue at our school. And he said, and plus at our school, it's really kind of this idea of the achievement gap. And WAS, the Western Association of Schools and Colleges, had recently been there at the school to accreditate the school. It got accreditation, but it was flagged as a school that was perpetuating inequalities by these racial groups, among these racial groups. So they said, if you're, we would really be happy if you could do this research, and that work could help us better know how to address some of these disparities in our school. And so for myself, that was perfect. I'm very much rooted, I told you, in the local, right? I'm a feminist, a Latina feminist, wanting to do work in my community. And that's kind of how the work that I've been doing. And this provided a unique space. Okay, great. I can do work on the school, do some interviews, listen to people, and then share it back out at the school. And so I was able to spend about 18 months at Southern California High School, working with a group of students from the Claremont colleges. And I would go into various classrooms and basically ask students. The teachers would give me the space, right? Who wants to share their stories? And the reality is that, students, they want to be listened to. And there's too few spaces still in our classrooms or our schools where people just have time to just to sit one-on-one and create a space. And so luckily, students wanted to share. And so we listened to student stories. I did interviews with teachers, with some parents, all around the climate at the campus and what was happening. And if you want to hear more about kind of what that
one of the things I'm really interested in is that, like what you're describing is kind of like, would that be, I mean, that kind of like ethnography, kind of like oral histories, and so much oftentimes it feels like with people who are like, get involved in like ethnography or oral histories or folklore, it oftentimes is they're interested in talking to people who are usually older, like usually like, oh, they lived something, they've been there, and we got to get this down. Not so much with the youth. That doesn't seem to be. So I'm kind of interested in like how that work was received amongst your peers. The fact that you were taking essentially ethnography from teenagers. I mean, how was that? How was that initially?
You mean like academics?
Yeah. Like how do they?
It's interesting because my work has, it depends on who, right? So, right. And it depends on what disciplines. Right. So all along in sociology, among some people, my work has been critiqued from the beginning because first it was too personal, right? Too much about La Puente, your own community. And so while you're saying the demographics are broad in the San Gabriel Valley, right? Some people saw it as too narrow. So I've also been critiqued for having too small of an N, kind of academic speak, meaning too few participants, as though one person's story isn't important. You have to have more and more, right? This quantitative way of looking at research. I've been called all kinds of things. So with this book, I think the interesting thing that, like you said, has gotten more attention. I think one is because it does look at Asian Americans and Latinos, where again, it came out about 8 years ago. So, but at that point, people weren't talking about, differential racialization and looking at different groups. I mean, there were certainly some, Leland Saito, some Sean Horton, people doing work in Monterey Park, Jose Calderon, but not a lot. And like you said, in this area, how can you're going to talk about race, you have to look at the racialization across different groups, because the ways that Latinos are defined is sometimes in opposition to Asian Americans, and likewise, and that was certainly the case at the school. So I think part of the reason why it was more well received was because one, it was looking at Asian Americans and Latinos, a group that hadn't been talked about. The reality too is the way that in sociology, the bigger the number of participants, the so-called better, right? All problematic narrative. But I did end up doing a lot of interviews. And I think that gave some people that gave the work validity to some people, right? So those are some of the contradictions. The idea was really just to create space for students to share their stories. And so that's what we did. Me and the college students, we would go and have pull students out of lunch or pull students out of classes and sit at the lunch tables outside and do one-on-one interviews. And students shared, right? They shared I asked broad, open-ended questions. Tell me about yourself. What's it like being a student? What do you want to see differently? And so it was hard hearing some of their stories, but also exciting to hear what they have to say.
So in your experience in collecting all these stories, what did you come away with, and what is the origin of this achievement gap, and what can be done?
Yes. So basically, I dispelled the whole idea of this achievement gap. So when I was at the school, everyone was talking about the achievement gap. They were talking about the gap, the gap, the gap, as though everybody knew what it was. And in so doing, it was kind of reifying the standardized test scores are the end all be all, and that those are the factors that determine what's happening in our schools. And so among the educators, it was an assumption that that we all knew what the gap was, and that the gap somehow was that Asian Americans are doing well and Latinos aren't, right? And that standardized test scores are the measure that should be used to determine academic excellence or achievement. So the reality is, just talking to students and also some of the teachers there, right, that this binary of Asian Americans are one way, Latinos are another way is highly problematic. And we know that, right? It kind of homogenizes whole groups of people, does not look at the salience of class, of generation, of colorism. All that was erased. And it puts the burden on students that somehow Latino students aren't good students and Asian Americans are, right? And so it doesn't look at all at the institutional structures and what our schools are doing. So listening to students reveals a whole host of ways that the systems aren't working. So for example, the first questions I would begin with students is, tell me about yourself. And for some of the Latino students, the first things they would say is, you know, I'm trying to prove people wrong. I'm like, what do you mean prove people wrong? You know, I'm a good student, or I want to go to college. So they're kind of defining themselves in opposition to this assumption that they weren't eligible to go to school, right? The reality at that school, which reflects schools across the nation, is the system of tracking the placement of students into honors, AP, college prep, non-college prep classes is highly skewed by race and by class. And so by and large, Latino students were not in these top tier classes. At that school, they have the International Baccalaureate program. And so they were being pushed away from going on to college, right? Things that we know that still persist. And the students spoke powerfully about what that meant. So much so that they started sometimes to believe that they weren't smart, right? For some of the Asian American students, the same question, tell me about yourself, was they would sometimes say, well, I'm not your typical Asian American student. I'm not good at math and science, right? So they had already been told through their educators and other things about this whole model minority, that somehow they had to be a certain kind of way. And so for some of the Asian American students, they also saw the disparate treatment, that they might be able to get what they said, a free pass. They could move around the campus and not be stopped and questioned. So I ended up writing a lot about demystifying this whole idea of achievement gap. And really it's about, let's look at all these other gaps, the wealth gap, the gap in terms of who's in the curriculum and who's not, the policing gap, right? Tracking, the tutoring gap, who has access to paid tutoring and how does that shape schooling? And the effects it has on students across the board.
So, you know, like there was a book, I don't remember, I can't remember the author right now, but I mean, I'm sure you're familiar with it. It's kind of, I was thinking about when you talk about this, the book, well, was it Racism Without Racists, right?
Yep.
And
Silva, yep. Yep.
right. So, I mean, like, so the question would be like, okay, so like, you know, like, oh my God, there's these problems. We don't know where they're coming from. We don't know, but I mean, oftentimes these things are being reified by the administration, by the teachers themselves, you know, and so did you find that as well? I mean, did
yes.
Yeah.
Yes, no, I mean, actually, I think Bonilla Silva, the Racism Without Racists, is unfortunately a perfect example of like the language, the narratives, the discourses that were being used. So it was not uncommon for teachers to talk about Asian Americans are this way, Latinos or Hispanics, right, as Aromas are this way. Again, in these kind of homogenized ways. And they didn't want to talk about class. Some of them said, no, to talk about class is taboo, right? So it was like this cultural narrative that was being used. And then in interviews, so the reality is at the school, I talk about kind of whiteness is invisibly present. So most of the students were students of color, almost equal numbers of Latinos and Asian Americans, not unlike the San Gabriel Valley demographics, right? But the educators, the administrators were by and large were white. The curriculum was white, right? The school, the prom, the assemblies, the rallies, right? Kind of infused with whiteness in all of these ways. And so some of the teachers, we would ask them, well, you know, because they felt very comfortable talking about students in these kind of hyper racialized ways. Well, tell us about yourself, right? How do you identify? And then there were some teachers that were like, that's not a fair question. What do you mean? I'm just an American. Or there was even one teacher that literally turned off the recording, the tape. That's not, you can't ask that. So without interrogating their own racialized privileges, they felt very comfortable perpetuating racist sentiment about Latino and Asian American students. And the whole notion of meritocracy too, right? Some students work hard, others don't. All of these discourses that reinforce this idea of racism without racists, right? But there were still some pretty racist comments that were said. It was kind of a continuum of ways that racism manifested itself at the school.
Oh, so what was it like taking? Was it like taking the interviews and notations of racists? I mean, what was that?
Yeah, I mean, well, yeah. So there, yeah, that was hard. That was, as you can imagine, right? So,
Yeah.
it was hard and just like really like hard to kind of hear, but then also just really after listening to the students, it was really sickening, right? I mean, like you get this gut feeling in your stomach. So like one of the counselors, she went on and on about white woman counselor talking about how she felt discriminated against and she couldn't get a job. Yeah, I mean, it was one after the other, and so my role was to try to kind of keep asking questions, to try to like dig deep and maybe think about where is that coming from? Why do you feel that way? And then for the students, right, to hear them talk about, so for example, students would say, yeah, teachers, sometimes they would put up quantitative statistics. You probably have seen the educational pipeline data that comes out of UCLA.
Yeah.
Okay, which can be very helpful and powerful if we deconstruct it and theorize around it and give reasons for it. Some teachers, I think maybe well-meaning, would put that data up and tell students, look, you got to do better, right? And so again, blaming students, something's wrong with you for these numbers, right? It's your fault. And so students would internalize this sentiment, and in the one-on-one interviews would use the same discourse, right, that they were hearing parroted by educators or in the mainstream media, things like Latino students, I'm just not smart. So I heard a lot what I talk about the 3 S's, smart, stupid, and scary. And they were really racist, right? So the idea that somehow Asian Americans are just smart, Latinos are stupid, right? Or don't care about schooling, and that Blacks were scary. And so it kind of hurts to say it because again, I never want to reinforce it, but it was so pervasive across the school that it needs to be named, to be kind of interrogated and explored. Where does this come from? And what are the scars that this narrative plays in terms of how people try to live their lives and try to do what they want to do for their own paths, right?
Yeah. So what can be done about this? It's kind of a larger philosophical question, but what can it be done about this? Because it's so much like this idea that you're stupid and you're not smart and you are meant to do certain things in this life, right? So even if you do end up like outside of that, even if you find a way out, even if you're tracked and you're like whatever, it's always this idea of a credit to the community. You're different, you're special, you're unique, right?
That's right.
Because you're not like the rest of your community. So I mean, like there's no way that individuals can escape this thing. It's part of just a larger. It's part of just the framework of the country. I mean, so
right.
like, what can be done? I mean, I understand like you're doing some really great work on the educational system, but it's almost like how we're okay. We're gonna have a racist prison system. We're gonna have a racist wage scale, but we're gonna have non-racist education. I mean, like it seems like.
That's right. That's it.
Yeah.
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's it. So on one hand, it is that the educational system reflects and perpetuates these larger structures within our society. Absolutely. And I think that's part of the frameworks that we have to understand. It's not just individual teachers. It's not just the individual counselor that I gave an example of, right? This is part of the foundation of the US, and we need to name it, deconstruct it, and really kind of transform those policies and practices that work to uphold it. So with academic profiling, which is a term I should say that came from a teacher. A teacher talked about use that framework, academic profiling, to kind of name what they were seeing at the school. when I went back to the school to then share the research, because this is the idea, like, how do you address it, right? We can see it when the students are naming it, we write about it, but it's so entrenched. What are the possibilities of change? I went back to the school with the idea that, okay, I'm going to share this research with you, and let's hope that there we can think more creatively about what are the policies and practices. So there's no, as you know, right, if we're thinking systemically, there's no one easy answer, right? This is built on, right, as we know, generations of power and inequality and racist sentiment and so on. But what I did offer was thinking about ethnic studies, not as the savior, right, that's going to come in and rectify the school, but if we don't even know our histories, if we don't even know the foundations that the US is built upon and in whose livelihoods have been at stake, then how can even individuals go forward and think in transformative ways? So, and at a school like Southern California High School, where the demographics are almost, again, equal numbers of Latinos and Asian Americans, there's a lot of kind of different experiences, but also some shared realities that need to be talked about. And so I did offer that as one possible strategy, as a space of, to bring students together, to foster critical consciousness and so on.
Yeah.
That's still in the works though. That hasn't gone forward.
Right. So you're a professor over at Pomona College. So just kind of making a smooth transition here. So tell us about, like, how did that come about? What has been your experience there at the Claremont colleges?
Yeah, so I've been there now over 20 years. If you caught me in the very beginning, right, I said my parents' public school emphasized the public good. Then how did I become a teacher at a private institution, right? The contradictions that many of us exist within. So I've been there since 1996, 97. I was finishing up at UCLA my graduate work, where I had been teaching at Casi Dominguez Hills and doing some teaching at UCLA, trying to make ends meet. And then a position opened up and a joint appointment in sociology and Chicano Latino studies. And at that point, it made sense for me to be, I thought, okay, great, I can do sociology, I can do Chicano Latino studies, I could also teach courses in women's studies, all kind of lenses and disciplines and ways of being that have been instrumental to my own work, to who I am. The Claremont College, the Chicano Studies Department at the Claremont College is one of the oldest in the US, coming about not unlike Cal State LA's, right, through student organizing, activism, students. But the way it was established at the Claremont colleges is they were initially all appointments were joint appointments. So all of us came in two departments, Chicano Latino Studies, or at that point it was Chicano Studies, right? And for me in sociology. But that's not really sustainable to building, right? If you're having to work in two departments, two different interests, and not having a space. So the last several years, I have moved my line to Chicano Latino Studies, and also moved my office to be able to work with colleagues there that have now more recently been hired in full-time positions.
Yeah. So how have you migrated all your work from, during this pandemic online? How have you experienced the migration of work from there to here?
Yeah. I mean, my approach to teaching is very much about interaction, community building, being fully present, right? We're talking about difficult personal and political issues. And so the classroom space to me is kind of one of those beautiful spaces where you can kind of create them with a collective of other people in the vision that we would like our societies to be in. So March 13th was the official last day. And for me, my last physical class was March 11th. And that was, as you can imagine, a tumultuous time, right? We were crying. I tried to create space with students in the class to think about how would we go back and kind of transition? What would that look like? How could we create our same classroom ethos? So for me, I went through kind of continuing to having Zoom meetings. So I continued our classroom time where we'd still come together to do whatever we could as best we could face to face and to hold space. So we still kept I altered the amount of readings and the assignments, made them more creative. But I felt it was important, and likewise the students did too, to still come together and do what they call synchronous, right, as opposed to asynchronous. So I think there is something about still carving out space for us to build as best we can.
Yeah,
Hasn't been easy.
that's
Um,
easy. Yeah.
yeah, because we are in the midst of a pandemic, and we know that the effects of it are different depending on people's race, class, gender, right? Blacks and Latinos economically, personally, right, have being the hardest hit.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I mean, and it's no mystery why. I mean, it's not like it's much like the education gap or the whatever gap. I mean, these disparities. I mean, it's not a mystery. It's present in everyday life. I mean, you look around you, like this is
yep.
why. Yeah.
It just it's amplified and maybe more apparent for people who maybe didn't know. But I'm not even sure if that's necessarily the case, right?
Yeah, yeah. So outside of this, outside of the campus, though, you're very active outside the campus. You work a lot with different organizations. I know that you've done some work with Jose Calderon. Can you talk about a little bit about the Latino Roundtable and some of the work they do and your interaction with them?
Yeah, so the Latina Roundtable, I mean, I've known Jose, right? Because Jose Calderon, well, he went to UCLA. I wasn't there at the time, but he was sociology at UCLA, and then he was at Pitzer College when I started, and he was teaching sociology and Chicano Latino studies at Pitzer College. So we became colleagues when I started at Pomona College because of the Claremont Colleges has an intercollegiate department, right? And kind of inspired by his work, the work that he's been doing. So I was involved in the Latino Roundtable. I've gone to multiple meetings. I would say more recently, I'm definitely a supporter, but in all honesty, I haven't been able to give as much to the Latino Roundtable. I live here in La Puente, and a lot of my work has been here in the city. So when I was again in the 1990s, doing my work on Chicano Mexicano relationships, met some of the community organizers back in the 90s, and some of those same organizers are people that I've been able to build relationships with decades later. And so we've worked together in our community to draw inspiration from other communities and push for sanctuary in the city, push for sanctuary or safe haven in the school district. Most recently working with some of the same community members and also my brother, drawing inspiration from other cities. And we're able to move to trustee area elections for our school board through the California Voting Rights Act to make sure that we have more representation on our Hasan La Puente Unified School District board, going back to kind of where change happens, right? The reality is Hasan La Puente has not been equitably represented on our school board. And so that was the most recent kind of struggle we've been pushing for. So doing a lot of work here in La Puente, both research, writing, and then organizing with community members, but drawing inspiration in many ways from what happens in other communities, right?
Yeah. So we have a question from the audience. They ask, Margaret Achille asks, Margaret is the executive director at the DAW.
Yes,
Yes,
I met Margaret, yes.
Okay, she says, do the students you interview have ideas of what changes they would like to see to improve the system?
Beautiful, beautiful. I like that question. So, because it goes back to the ethos of centering students' voices, right? So, I mean, some of them did talk about wanting to learn more about their history, their even the local, right? Learning more about local communities, calling to task kind of the assumptions that teachers have of them and kind of shifting those assumptions. I think for some, going back to some of what Asian American students had been seeing, some of them were talking about seeing the ways that they were privileged compared to Latino students. And so really calling that out. And so making sure educators are aware of those disparities in terms of how they treat students. Pomona, I've been able to work with some of the teachers at Pomona High School through Chicano Studies. Arturo Molina is the current teacher of Chicano Studies there. Cathy de los Rios was initially. And so I also think about the high school students there at Pomona High School, yeah, and what they see since they've had the privilege of being able to take a Chicano Studies class, right? They also oftentimes will see the institutional injustices that are occurring. And so making sure that our schools are providing spaces for students to learn those histories. That's how I've been connected with Margaret and the DA through Arturo Molina, because a couple of our classes, we had students spotlight their own work there. Yeah. So it's good that she's on the call.
Oh, that's fantastic. That's fantastic. And we can definitely, definitely, I'm sure that when we come out of this, and maybe even we'll find ways that we can work together during this, depending on how long it goes. But I'm sure we're gonna be working more there at the DAW. The other thing, I guess, I want to be respectful of your time. I know we talked about a certain time frame on this, so just tell us what's coming next, and how can we connect to some of your work, and how can we connect to some of these projects? How can anybody?
Yeah. What's coming next? Can you say?
Oh, do you have any books on the horizon? You got any manuscripts?
Got you. Thank you for that. So
Yeah.
I am still aiming to write. I'm working on the 2016-2017 struggle for sanctuary here in La Puente, but the San Gabriel Valley, San Bernardino counties. I've been doing interviews with students, with community organizers, activists, and since I was involved locally, I've been writing about that.
Mm-hmm.
So I've been lucky to be able to listen to local organizers who have been talking about what inspires them to do the work that they do and what sustains them. So I'm in the middle of writing about the struggle for sanctuary, generational differences in terms of how we approach organizing, and what is the role of memories in all the work that we do. So that's a little bit. I've also been doing a little bit more poetry. That's been my kind of go-to place to either do rants or just to get my thoughts on paper. But
where can people find more about your poetry, and where can people find more about your poetry, and then where can people buy your book or your books?
Yeah, so poetry, I've just been sending it to Latino Rebels. If there's places that are interested in, let me know. But I came to it late. For me, it's really just a space to put my words on paper and my emotions on paper, as like I said, rants. So Latino Rebels, you can find many of the rants there. in terms of so books, usually the presses will have them. So academic profiling, I would say Minnesota Press. They will have them, and sometimes libraries will have them in ebooks, so people can access it there. And I know that those are accessible, right? I also have a Learning from Latino Teachers, which centers the voices of K through 12 Latino teachers in our area and talks about what were their schooling experiences. And that comes out of Josie Bass Press, Wiley Press. And then the first one, Becoming Neighbors, is Texas Press. So I would say those, or most local bookstores that still do exist, you can get them through those as well.
Okay, cool. I'll try and find the links and put them below. So thank you so much, Dr. Ochoa, for your time. It's been really illuminating, and it's also been really great to talk about San Gabriel Valley and get that information out there, because I don't think a lot of people know what they should know.
Thank you for all of your work and for amplifying people's voices.
All right, thank you.
Take care.